And the hashtag is morning at NTV on Twitter. We are also big on Facebook as well as on YouTube. Allow us now return to another discussion, the Kickstarter, inclusion of persons with disability in election processes. Before I introduce my very eminent guests, let me just give you a preamble to the discussion. Persons with disabilities, participation in the democratic process in general and general elections in particular are provided for in international, regional, as well as national instruments. According to the Democracy Index for 2020, almost 70% of all countries globally recorded a decline in the overall score as country after country locked down to protect lives from the novel COVID-19. On the African continent, and more particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, the average score fell to its lowest since 2010. The flawed electoral processes and the lack of political pluralism was flagged as the main culprit for the poor performance. Uganda's democracy ratings remained relatively low, characterized by weak electoral processes and government institutions that continue to flatter to deceive. I'm joined by Ivan Otim, a coordinator at Youth Coalition for Electoral Democracy, as well as Florence Ndagire, a persons with disability rights lawyer at the African Youth Development Link. Lady and gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Let me begin with Ivan Otim, the coordinator for Youth Coalition for Electoral Democracy. In my preamble that I've been offered here, there is talk of a score, and Uganda seems to be doing pretty badly when it comes to issues of persons with disability participating in electoral process. First, give us a preamble. What is the state of affairs?
So thank you so much. Good morning, Ugandans. First of all, I would like to say that, first of all, democracy is more meaningful when people meaningfully participate. And for us, we know that elections is part of that benchmark of a democratic country or culture.
That's right.
And it is determined in the lens of free, fairness, inclusion, and also more meaningfully participation. So when you look at how our electoral process has progressively been undertaken, the dimensions on inclusion have kind of been limited. And it's one of the things that we are trying to put out there to all the stakeholders to understand that even amidst the progressive levels of our electoral process, the limitations on how people with disabilities meaningfully participate is one of the greatest issues that we must be able to contextualize and come back as a country to reflect on, because it's more a limitation than kind of a progressive situation to include them in the process.
Okay, that is a very telling. Florence Ndagire, within the aegis of the African Youth Development Link, the electoral colleges of persons with disabilities also do oversee and conduct elections on their own. And I'm sure before the general overview of the electoral process across the country is even brought into question, what is the state of affairs within the electoral colleges?
Good morning, viewers. The state of affairs of electoral colleges is that elections are organized for members of parliament at the national level as opposed to regional. This reduces levels of accountability to their members, and the challenge is that they will always be elected by all regions as opposed to a single region. So members of parliament in most cases don't go back to their regional members that elected them, and sometimes they end up being elected from either two regions as opposed to the 4 regions of Uganda. The other challenge is that within that confine, many categories of people with disabilities are not represented because of the high numbers of a particular category of disability. And also the lack of a disability coding within the parliamentary elections processes is also leaves a lot to be desired, because they only recognize the deaf, the blind, and the physically disabled, leaving out other categories of people with disabilities. This means their issues cannot be represented, and these members are not accountable to them. Okay. And it always remains a challenge in the electoral processes.
Could you throw more light on what you said? Coding
disability coding means the identification of different categories of persons with disabilities provided by Schedule 2 of the Persons with Disabilities Act. So it provides for eight categories of people with disabilities, and they include those with hearing impairment, who are normally known as deaf, the blind, who are visually impaired, persons with physical disability who have limitations in mobility or lack of limbs, persons with psychosocial disability and are presented as those with mental disabilities, persons with albinism, they have challenges with their skin colors, persons with who are deaf-blind, so they are both deaf and blind, and that's a multiple disability, persons with intellectual disabilities, among others.
Okay. Ivan, when she says, now I understand the coding aspect of it, it's a whole plethora of different classes of persons with disabilities. Right now, when it comes to engagement with the Electoral Commission and all the other stakeholders within Uganda's electoral process, where are we when it comes to ensuring that this whole spectrum of persons with disabilities are attended to in equal measure, not as a result of either numbers of a certain segment being more powerful than another?
Yes, first of all, I would like to excuse the Electoral Commission because one, there is no national data that is disaggregated in terms of disability. And from the basis of what she has just talked about, it now comes back to the national framework. That if, as a country, you don't have data to understand how many people of the different categories are existing, that means there's no way you're going to be able to plan for them. So for us, in our call for a kind of a reform, we're actually asking UBOS, and we know, for example, the disability fraternity has already reached out to UBOS to actually improve on the data sheet that they are going to use in the collection of the national census data, so that they go as far as identifying disability categorization. So for us, when we have a data sheet for the national data that is improved, then we can come back and ask the stakeholders to say, okay, we have data. We know, for example, in Kasese, on polling station A, there are people with disabilities who are visually impaired, and they're just 5. Can we be able to plan for them? Can we be able to support them with accessible formats of communication tools that they can be able to use to be able to make their voice heard? Because an election is a fundamental place where it's not only just you giving out your power, it's where you make a decision from that basis where you're determining who will best represent you. So your voice must be heard at that ballot, and so everyone's voice must be heard through making that defined.
If I were an official at the Electoral Commission, I would be feeling very thawed this morning, because rarely does the Electoral Commission get off the hook and gets excused, and of course now that throws the light of the Uganda Bureau of Statistics to be able to provide this very important data. When you look at the whole process of elections, attention now could be directed towards the processes of actually voting, ability to vote, who votes, are they able to cast the ballot. But Florence, when you look at petitions in this country, it is something that is always prolonged. And if persons with disabilities are involved in these petitions, how fast is that process dealt with? Is there any mechanism within the judicial framework that expedites or offers special attention to persons with disability in resolving election petitions?
There is particularly no special mechanism. They follow the general provisions provided for electoral petitions, and of course, as we say, justice delayed is justice denied, but generally election petitions might prove to be expensive to persons with disabilities.
That's right.
Especially if they have to hire lawyers, and also the prejudice that is embedded in society within the justice system itself sometimes does not allow people with disabilities to represent themselves, to act as witnesses, and to defend themselves just in case an election petition arises. So that is a challenge, but I think we are not done with the challenges of elections. We shouldn't talk about petitions.
Well, it's something that is important because many a media player gets to understand the challenge when somebody has spoken about it or it comes forth. Now, I'm only trying to ensure that before the questions are asked ahead of 2026, we can understand if a petition comes through. You're a lawyer.
Yeah, I am. But we follow the general electoral processes of Uganda, as well as the legal frameworks provided for petitions. Under
the framework of the Uganda Law Society, there is the pro bono aspect where a Ugandan who might not be able to access a lawyer or counsel for that matter is able to actually receive justice within the frameworks of the PWDs. And you're a lawyer, and I'm sure you can give us good perspective on that. Are there persons with disabilities who might not afford one and can access pro bono services? Many people with disabilities belong to the poorest of the poor and cannot afford to pay for legal services. But the challenge is that they are not even aware that the pro bono services are available. We have a few legal aid clinics at the Law Development Center and at Makerere University. But sometimes they are also constrained because people with disabilities are many who might want to bring their cases. So it's best that someone is able to afford to pay for the services as opposed to waiting for pro bono, because it might take time to resolve such cases. Ivan.
Yes.
Elections are expensive business to conduct, to maintain, but to also prepare for.
Yes.
Within the workings of the NGO world and look at persons with disability, just take us through where the challenges are. We've had the taps are closing as a result of funding freezes from across the globe, conditioned by many aspects, including COVID-19. Some want to attribute the war in Ukraine and Russia to that. It's always a convenient excuse. Tell us about the current framework of funding and how it's affecting the ability to streamline the electoral process so that persons with disability can be able to achieve their goals and objectives.
From that perspective, political party financing is one of those greatest things that we have probably progressed as a country. And for me, when it comes to that lens, I would talk about one of the very important things that we can all aspire to, either have it withdrawn, kind of the nomination costs of an election. So elections in their entirety are supposed to be a mechanism through which people offer themselves choice to be representatives of others. And in that basis, there has to be a middle ground where the opportunity for someone to come up and offer themselves should not be limiting. So when you have the issue about nomination fees from the lens of youth PWDs, it's actually a barrier than some progressive mode of them to participate.
That's right.
And we believe that political party leaders that are in power right now must be able to recognize that in the trends that we're moving in, we're moving in a trend where young people are going to be the leaders of tomorrow. So if we have policies and legal frameworks that are deterrent for them to take up certain positions, then we ask the question, who's going to be able to be in those positions if we have the legal frameworks that are unfavorable? So nomination fees is one of those greatest things that we can be able to speak about. But also, beyond even the cost of an election, we know political parties, for example, have their internal costs where you have to pay internal facilitation for a political parties.
That's right.
So you have a candidate wanting to be able to be maybe nominee for a political party, having to undergo a cost internally for a political party, and then come back at a national level, and then come back to kind of finance the nomination fees at national level. And this is also despite the aspect that they have to go into a campaign, which we know that our elections have become highly monetarized. And in the reflections, when you look at the monetarization of our elections, it's actually one of the biggest challenges that we have as a country. That if we don't deal with the monetarization of an elections, we are going to increasingly become having leaders who are responsive to the issues but rather will have the mandate that they have brought themselves into power, and after the 5 years they will not do anything for you. So because they know they have already paid you off. So we have those challenges to deal with, and we must be able to reflect them or reflect on them as a country.
Okay, closely related, and this question goes to Florence and Ndagire. When the persons with disability stakeholders often are at national symposia or events, we tend to see a rollout from government of funding and programs that are designed to ensure that either the services or activities that are going on are streamlined and made better. How do you balance, for example, receiving money as a minority group from the government, but you want to be part of a political process that is heavily skewed in favor of that government or administration? How do you, what is the balancing act there? Does it affect your ability to actually, you know, be part and parcel of the process as effectively as you ought to be, or it is something many of you could have resigned to?
Providing funding to minority groups does not take away our right to participate in the political processes of the country. Of course, this has been provided for under the objective and directive principles of state policy of our constitution. That's objective 2, that guarantees the right to participation in democratic processes for all citizens, and the right to fair representation under objective 6, and under Article 17, participation in the electoral processes. So this is a right that has been granted to us, not by the state, but once you are born as a citizen of Uganda, you have a right to participate in the electoral democracy. So, but the challenges we face as people with disabilities in participating in democratic processes are enormous, not because the country doesn't recognize us, but sometimes they are not aware that we are being excluded. I'll for example, say that the registration processes and display of polling display of polling registers are normally put in places that are not accessible for us. Electoral information remains largely inaccessible, especially when it's not provided in Braille for the blind, symbols and pictures for those with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, and a lack of sign language during the voter sensitization and education. They really largely remain problematic. And as if that is not bad enough, the staff of the Electoral Commission have not been sensitized on the reasonable accommodation needs of the different categories of persons with disabilities. So they end up standing in long queues. Sometimes those who have physical disabilities cannot stand for a long time without being supported to vote. And those with albinism cannot stand under the sun because it affects their skin colors. So they end up not exercising their rights and return home because the process itself does not grant them affirmative action, at least to go and vote first. Yeah, that's really a challenge. And then with the information itself, sometimes the ballots, in most cases the ballots are in print, and for us we can't see, and there is no symbol or assistive technology provided to enable us identify the person we are voting. So that remains a challenge, because our support persons, for example the guides, when you tell them I want to vote so and so, they might end up being bribed to vote a different person simply because you cannot see. And that remains largely a challenge, because as visually impaired people, we are over 2 million people if you look at the statistics, and we believe we have a right to access to information that enable us to vote, and we need an enabling environment that is friendly to be mainstreamed in electoral processes. And then the lack of representation at the senior management level of the Electoral Commission also leaves a lot to be desired, because they cannot understand our issues. We need some level of lived experience of disability to be brought on board in the electoral processes by us, representing ourselves and ensuring that we articulate those issues right from the design of electoral processes and policies.
Wrap this up, Ivan Otim, are you going to push for the Electoral Commission to have a commissioner for persons with disabilities?
It is something out there within the state objective she has stated that the government shall ensure principles of equality across. We know it's an issue that we are basically putting on the table for stakeholders to understand the relevance. And she's just not mentioned it very well, that one, when you have someone who's living with a disability, probably they may have a know on how they can be able to have inclusion of these categories across the board. So it's something that we're just putting out.
All right. Yeah. We shall be following that up, and perhaps the conversation when it comes up next week, next month, or even any other time, we shall be able to ask for accountability on our part as media players to all stakeholders. Many thanks, Ivan Otim, Coordinator for the Youth Coalition for Electoral Democracy, and thanks to you too, Florence Ndagire, a Persons with Disability Rights Lawyer at the African Youth Development Link, for the perspective and, of course, insight into what is happening in as far as the electoral process for PWDs is concerned. That will do it for Kickstarter and the day's discussions here on Morning at NTV. I would like to pay special tribute to the gentlemen and ladies who ensured that this program is a success Monday to Friday. We also want to thank those that were in the field. Juma Kiria, again, many thanks for the report of the Minister Beatrice Akelo there, inspecting and monitoring projects of government and how they are rolling out in Kigezi. I'm trying to find out here what the birthday rituals that we have today, and so that we can be able to wish those that have reached that particular threshold as they look forward to the next 365 days. But the vagaries of technology seem to be getting the better of me. I'll leave it at that and wish you a good day. I'll see you tomorrow. From the rest of the team, it's goodbye.